The old dirt road crunched under the tires of Sarah and Tom's Jeep. They had been driving for hours, the GPS leading them further into the desolate countryside. Their destination, a dilapidated farmhouse, miles from the nearest town. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. "Are you sure this is the place?" Tom asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's perfect," she replied, a touch too brightly. "Just wait till you see the inside." As they pulled up to the house, the headlights illuminated peeling paint, boarded-up windows, and a front porch that sagged precariously. They stepped out of the car and into the suffocating stillness. Tom reached for Sarah's hand, his grip tight. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, her throat suddenly dry. The front door creaked open, reluctantly yielding to Sarah's push. A musty, stale odor wafted out. Sarah flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The house was eerily silent, the air thick with dust and the weight of the past. The symbols were burned into the peeling wallpaper, crudely drawn but undeniably present. They were unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, a series of strange, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering beam of her flashlight. A cold dread settled in her stomach. This was more than just an abandoned house. "What is this place?" Tom whispered, his voice tight with apprehension. On the floor, half hidden under a pile of rotting wood, lay a book. As Sarah picked it up, a wave of dizziness washed over her, and a low humming sound seemed to vibrate from the very walls of the house. The book felt strangely warm in her hands, as if it were alive. The first page was filled with spidery handwriting, the ink faded but the message clear. "The silence here isn't empty," it read. "It's listening." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was just an old book, she told herself, just an abandoned house. But deep down, a primal fear began to stir. The attic was stifling, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. Cobwebs hung from every rafter, and the only light came from their flickering flashlights. "Did you hear that?" Tom whispered, his voice strained. Sarah paused, holding her breath. At first, there was nothing but the creaking of the old house settling around them. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. The whisper stopped. Tom took a step closer to the shrouded furniture, his hand reaching out to pull back the sheet. The whispers started again, louder this time, circling them in the darkness. Sarah swore she could feel a cold breath on her neck, even though they were alone in the attic. As they moved deeper into the attic, the air grew noticeably colder. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the humming sound, which seemed to be growing stronger. Tom nodded, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "There's a definite cold spot here," he said, his voice hushed. Sarah pulled out a small thermometer from her backpack, her hands shaking slightly. She held it up, and they both watched in stunned silence as the temperature plummeted. The humming sound intensified, vibrating through the floorboards and into their very bones. The whispers seemed to be everywhere now, surrounding them, taunting them. They were no longer just whispers, they were words, phrases uttered in a language Sarah had never heard before. The cold spot intensified, the air growing heavy and oppressive. It felt as if an unseen presence had entered the attic, something ancient and malevolent. In the far corner of the attic, tucked away behind a pile of rotting boxes, Sarah noticed something. A small wooden box, its surface carved with the same strange symbols they had seen on the wall downstairs. Slowly, cautiously, Sarah approached the box. Her hand trembled as she reached out and lifted the lid. The humming sound reached a fever pitch, and the whispers became a chorus of voices screaming in her ears. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single unblinking eye. It was inhuman, reptilian, the pupil a slit that seemed to widen as Sarah stared at it. The eye blinked, and Sarah swore she heard a voice inside her head, cold and reptilian. "We have been waiting for you." The book, heavy in Sarah's hands, seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Its leather cover was cold to the touch, yet the pages seemed to radiate a strange heat as she carefully turned them. The spidery handwriting, penned in faded ink, chronicled the lives of the family who once called this farmhouse home. The family who had vanished without a trace. Sarah read aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the oppressive silence of the attic. "The symbols, they call to me. I see them in my dreams. I hear them when the silence falls." Tom, his face pale with apprehension, watched as Sarah flipped through the brittle pages. "This is getting weird, even for you," he said, his voice tight. "Maybe we should just go." But Sarah was transfixed. Samuel's words painted a picture of growing paranoia, of a darkness that had slowly enveloped the family. A small, faded photograph slipped from between the pages, fluttering to the dusty floorboards. Sarah picked it up, her breath catching in her throat. It was a family portrait. A man, a woman, and a young boy, all with warm smiles and eyes that seemed to sparkle with life. But there was something deeply unsettling about the image. The faces of the family had been scratched out, defaced with violent strokes of a pen. The book fell from Sarah's grasp as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The attic around them seemed to dissolve, the present melting away to reveal the past. Sarah found herself standing in the same attic, but it was different. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, and a single kerosene lantern cast long dancing shadows on the faces of the family huddled around a wooden table. Samuel, his face a mask of fear and desperation, scribbled furiously in the leather-bound book. His wife, her eyes wide with terror, clutched their young son to her chest, his face pale and streaked with tears. Following the boy's gaze, Sarah saw it. A blinding light, pulsating with an otherworldly energy, pierced through a crack in the boarded-up window. The sepia tones faded, and Sarah was ripped back to the present, the musty attic swirling back into focus around her. The humming sound, though fainter now, continued to reverberate through the attic, a constant reminder of the horror she had just witnessed. Sarah stumbled back, her hand flying to her chest as if she could physically push down the fear that threatened to consume her. "Sarah! What is it? What did you see?" Tom's voice, sharp with concern, broke through the haze of panic that had descended over her. But as Sarah opened her mouth to speak, to share the terrifying vision of the past, she found herself paralyzed, her throat constricted, her voice trapped in her chest. "Sarah, say something! What's happening?" Tom's voice was frantic now, his face a mask of fear as he shook her gently, desperately trying to elicit a response. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the paralysis lifted. Sarah drew in a shuddering breath, the air burning in her lungs. But as she opened her mouth to speak, to reassure Tom that she was all right, a voice emerged that was not her own. It was a guttural sound, distorted and warped, as if it were being forced through a broken speaker. It was the language from the attic, the language of the whispers, flowing from her lips with chilling fluency. Tom stumbled back, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Sarah, is that you?" But Sarah couldn't answer. The symbols, the ones burned into the walls of the farmhouse, began to appear on her skin, glowing faintly beneath her clothes. They writhed and pulsed as if alive, spreading across her arms like a macabre tattoo. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread, a feeling that something ancient and malevolent had awoken, and it was speaking through Sarah, using her voice, her body to deliver a message of unimaginable terror. Tom stared at his hand, his breath catching in his throat. The symbol, a complex pattern of swirling lines and strange glyphs, pulsed with an eerie internal light. "Sarah, look!" he whispered, his voice hoarse with a fear he couldn't quite comprehend. He held out his hand, but Sarah recoiled, her eyes wide with a mixture of concern and something akin to primal dread. It was a chilling echo of the symbols they had found throughout the house. The symbols were spreading, marking not only the house but also its inhabitants. Tom couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He paced the length of the dilapidated living room, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. He didn't understand the language, but it flowed from him with an ease that terrified him. Sarah watched him from the safety of a dust-covered armchair. "They're here," Tom whispered, his voice hoarse with paranoia. "Can't you feel them, Sarah? They're watching us." She couldn't see anything, but the air crackled with an unseen energy. The symbols on Tom's skin glowed brighter, the lines pulsing with an eerie life of their own. "Tom, it's okay," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "We'll figure this out. We'll be all right." She reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched away as if burned. The fear in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. It was as if the Tom she knew was slipping away. "You don't understand," Tom whispered, his voice a raspy echo. He backed away, shaking his head, speaking in a torrent of incomprehensible sounds. Sarah's heart ached with profound grief. Her gaze fell on the open book in her lap. A single phrase, underlined heavily, jumped out at her. "It divides us, turns us against each other." A cold dread settled in her stomach. Was this what was happening to Tom? Was the force in this house turning him against her? They stood there, facing each other across a chasm of fear. The symbols on Tom's skin pulsed with an eerie light. The air crackled with anticipation. Something was about to happen. Sarah could feel it in her bones. The shadows in the farmhouse seemed to writhe and coil, no longer content to cling to the corners. They twisted into grotesque shapes at the edge of Sarah's vision. The throbbing pulse reverberated in her teeth, emanating from the shadows themselves. Tom stood in the swirling darkness, his silhouette stark against the shifting shadows. The symbols on his skin glowed with an unnatural intensity, casting flickering patterns on the walls. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, clutching the leather-bound book to her chest. From the swirling shadows, a tall, thin figure emerged. Sarah sensed its cold, calculating gaze fixed upon her. A blinding light erupted from the symbol on Tom's hand, engulfing the room in an ethereal glow. The shadows recoiled, hissing and spitting like living creatures thrust into a fire. Sarah shielded her eyes, momentarily blinded by the sudden, intense illumination. When she could see again, Tom was facing the shadowy figure, his face bathed in an otherworldly light. The figure extended a long, slender hand towards Tom, its touch followed by a surge of energy that made the air crackle and pop. The humming sound reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very foundation of the farmhouse. Sarah felt a scream building in her chest, but it died in her throat, choked by the sheer terror that gripped her. Tom, his eyes vacant and distant, his body seemingly moved by an unseen force, was drawn towards the shadowy figure like a moth to a flame. He reached out, his hand disappearing into the darkness that surrounded the figure. The light intensified, engulfing them both in a blinding flash that seemed to last an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. Silence descended upon the farmhouse, heavy and absolute. The shadows were gone. Tom was gone. Only Sarah remained, kneeling on the dusty floorboards, clutching the leather-bound book to her chest, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The silence was broken only by the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart. She reached out a trembling hand, but there was nothing there. No Tom, no shadowy figure, no blinding light, only cold air and the lingering scent of ozone. Her gaze fell on a small, folded piece of paper lying on the floor where Tom had stood just moments before. It was the only evidence he had ever been there, the only tangible proof that the nightmare she had just witnessed was real. With shaking hands, she picked up the note and unfolded it. The words scrawled in Tom's familiar handwriting sent a fresh wave of terror through her. "Don't trust them," the note read. "Don't trust the light. Run." But where could she run? Where could she possibly go to escape the nightmare that had already claimed Tom? As if in answer to her unspoken question, the humming sound began to resonate through the farmhouse once more, low and insistent, a harbinger of something terrible to come. The air grew cold, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, pulsating with a life of their own. They were back. And this time, Sarah was alone. Sarah stood frozen in the center of the room, the weight of Tom's words pressing down on her. "Don't trust the light." The humming sound grew louder, a constant throbbing pulse that seemed to vibrate in her bones. She could feel her sanity slipping, the edges of reality blurring as the terror tightened its grip. The symbols on the wall pulsed with a sickly light, their patterns swirling as if alive. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. The shadows in the corners seemed to writhe and coil, as if something ancient and malevolent was moving within them. She caught her reflection in the dusty surface of an old mirror. Her face, pale and streaked with tears, stared back at her, eyes wide with terror. And then, for the briefest moment, she saw them. 2 points of light glowed with an unnatural intensity. They were eyes cold and calculating, watching her from the shadows. Sarah whirled around, her scream dying in her throat as her flashlight cut through the darkness. But there was nothing there, only the shadows, deeper and more menacing, and the ever-present humming sound. She was being hunted.